Hello and welcome to Contramundum. I am Andrew Isker and this is CJ Engel. And today joining us is distinguished guest, author, Claremont Senior Fellow, Jeremy Carl. Welcome to the show, Jeremy. How are you?
I'm doing great, Andrew. Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, today our discussion will be on the term the woke right. Right? People have been seeing this term online. What is the woke right? What is that about? That sounds scary. What is it? Uh, well, all you need to know is it is just a really stupid term that is meaningless that bad people like to use. Right? Is that accurate, CJ?
It's either so broadly applied that like everybody from Aristotle to Thomas Jefferson to like 19th century American political actors are all woke right, or it's nonsense. I'm good with either option. I mostly think it's nonsense, and I think I mean, and we can get like Jeremy's take on this, but it's mostly a product of people just hearing for the first time that there is a non-liberal right.
Yeah.
And that we
Yeah.
are rediscovering it and bringing it back into the equation. I think that's what's going on here. So
Yeah. So, Jeremy, what do you think? What do you think about this term?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a marketing term, right? And James Lindsay's been pushing it, and I don't like any types of civil war, no pun intended, on the right or even right adjacent. And so, I don't have any unfriendly personal dealings with James in the past, but I do kind of feel like this was a fairly this kind of frankly dishonest thing that he wrote for American Reformer that he tried to sort of pass off as, oh, this is just Marx, but I'm going to change around like every single word and then, pretend it's the same thing. I mean, I felt that was a pretty hostile and kind of not particularly honest act. So maybe the gloves sort of have to come off even for agreeable folks like me. I mean, I have a slightly different principle critique. And that is, and maybe it's just I'm showing my inner James Burnham a little bit too much here, but I kind of view it as like, James is just over intellectualizing politics. And if I were to kind of have a kind of principal critique of his thought generally, it would be that in that, he sees everything. It's like, well, this thing that I would just easily explain by kind of like conflicting group interests, and that's that are not reconcilable. He says, actually, this is all it dates back to this reading of Foucault and whatever else. And I'm like, it's actually a little simpler than that. And so
No, it's a Hegelian dialectic, Jeremy. It's a Hegelian.
Yeah, right. No, I mean that's the thing, right? Like not everything is a dialectic, and intellectuals when they see that nail, they've got the hammer, and that's what they want to beat on. But I think often it's a lot simpler and stupider, and we kind of can misread it when we try to make this, about something very fancy and just intellectual. Like even I'm wearing my Martin Luther T-shirt. You can't totally see it here, but we were talking about this offline. But even, of course, Martin Luther. I mean, obviously he had very substantive and serious critiques of the Catholic Church, but the reason why that was successful was not necessarily about the intellectual substance of those critiques, but about power relations and all sorts of things that were going on in Europe at that time. And I think when you miss that piece of it, you kind of are missing a pretty big piece of it.
Well, it's
Yes.
funny because like one of the things that Tom Woods, he quote tweeted James too, and Tom Woods is a libertarian. He's got a lot of sympathies for the classical liberal tradition, and he pointed out that like the entire ethos and motivating factor of classical liberalism was about various forms of class dynamics. I mean, they really pushed hard on that. That was sort of the animating factor of classical liberalism was the fact that people were suffering under different types of oppression by the royal classes. And so classical liberalism itself is born within this, structure of political confrontation. There are these group interests at play. I mean, even like as far back as the Magna Carta, it wasn't that like everybody decided individually to like agree with liberalism or something. No, the merchant classes felt like they were getting an unfair shake within the power structure in England. This is how politics works.
It's always worked.
And when we delineate that and when we focus on that in terms of pointing out that like 20th century liberalism is basically just like a myth,
Right.
The fact that we're castigated as borrowing from the woke left is just a product of an inability to recognize political reality, which of course is a
Mhm.
James Burnham point.
Right. Well, and even and I sort of first of all, I agree with those statements entirely, and I kind of add to that that it's sort of silly and beneath a person who is having a pretense of being an intellectual to imply that someone who would even in any way find a part of a Marxist analysis of something to have validity, that they're somehow a Marxist, that in and of itself is not serious. And there's all sorts of people who are, and I would certainly include myself. I mean, I think Marx was wrong about all particulars, and obviously, I mean, all core particulars, and that
Mhm.
his his diagnosis for society caused a tremendous amount of harm. But there's all sorts of scholars who are serious scholars who are in no way Marxist, who have at times borrowed some insight of somebody like Marx and said, hey, that actually might be valid for this particular thing. So it's just, besides the fact of the things that you just laid out that I think are entirely realistic in terms of even a libertarian or paleo-libertarian analysis of these type of situations, it's just not worthy of being a serious intellectual to take somebody whose thought that you might broadly strongly disagree with and say, hey, every single aspect of their thought is completely irrelevant. And similarly, it's like if Hitler liked dogs and I like dogs, it doesn't mean I'm a Nazi, right? I mean, it's like it's that level of silliness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, totally, yeah. So, like, what do you think about broadly? Like, you actually mentioned James Burnham, and that's an interesting segue. He was a critic of liberalism. He defined it in a way where basically that the Western civilization sees the political horizon, and they deny the fact that there are enemies out there, and that's
Yeah,
sort of what he saw liberalism is. So, like, liberalism is not the enemy.
right,
The left is the enemy. The liberals basically just deny that there is any enemy at all, and that we
right.
are, breaching various, unbreachable principles by engaging in politics. And that was sort of James Burnham's point. So maybe interact with that a little bit, and then talk about, why is liberalism coming into question, and why is it a good time to recover the insights of someone like Burnham?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think first of all, like the average person who's operating here, and I'm not necessarily saying this is James in this case, but a lot of people who are participating in these debates don't even understand in any serious way a difference between the left and liberals, which is you and I recognize these are entirely different categories, right? And that in many ways the liberal is the dupe of the left, right? And they kind of always have been. I'm just blanking on the guy who wrote I think it was Paul Kengor maybe, who wrote the book Dupes, about basically how the liberal, broadly speaking, left of the mid 20th century was constantly a dupe for the actual communists who were happy to use them.
Mhm.
So I think you do have those very different groups, but we are challenging this kind of liberal notion that I mean, obviously, and you and I may have even slightly different stances on this, obviously, but I think sort of more broadly, I'd say that I'm certainly critical, and I would imagine you're critical of this kind of liberal notion of the neutral public space,
Mhm.
that we can just have the contest of ideas, and that's how things work out. I think we're more sensitive to power relations in the way that Burnham was, in the way that Burnham student Sam Francis was, that all sorts of things, like that kind of come into play. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that this is an important distinction. And I think, again, people in the establishment are just very uncomfortable when you challenge any of the 20th century liberal consensus that even people who think that they are on the right are basically, in many cases, unconsciously buying into. And by the way, I mean, I probably challenge that consensus less than some other folks in
Mhm.
our world, but at least I do recognize that it's a consensus and that it's fine to interrogate it. It doesn't make us bad people to interrogate it. And arguably, we need to overthrow that consensus to some degree if we're going to make any progress.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, totally. I agree with that, and I know Andrew does too. But the 20th century liberalism, I
Mhm.
think it's unable to recognize civilizational enemies, and more importantly, as a consequence of that, it's unable to act in a way that would actually secure our way of life and the things that we hold dear. I mean, they really do not like the idea of this is one of the ironies of it all. So the 20th century, in my opinion, was largely like a massive project of undermining the old constitutional norms. And anytime we recognize the fact that these enemies, the domestic enemies who basically dominate the administrative state, need to be pushed back with power, we're blamed for breaching the Constitution, the very Constitution that has basically been liquidated first in the New Deal, then in the Civil Rights Act, and all the bureaucratic machinations that were set up during the Civil Rights Act. If you oppose that, you're seen as a racist and all these things. But like the 20th century is this massive project of undermining the old republic, and we need to recognize that and be very serious about the fact that only power can confront power. I mean, this is a classic Burnham insight.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And again, right, as you point out, I mean, every single one of the founders would be, possibly excepting Jefferson, would be a right-wing Christo-fascist and even Jefferson would be canceled for other reasons.
Probably,
right?
yes. Yeah.
But and I think this also comes up. Yes, I mean, we need to confront power with power, and we just need to be very honest about where the country has gone. And I think at the same time, I mean, this kind of bleeds into a lot of the debates on Christian nationalism, and I know that you guys have been very involved in that, right? It's just that we, when even somebody like me, who's probably less purely in the kind of Christian nationalist camp than maybe you guys or some of our mutual acquaintances. But, somebody like me is like, well, we're not in a neutral public space that bears any resemblance to what the constitutional order was. You can go back in history and find all these Supreme Court decisions, and these didn't start here, but from the 1940s to the 1970s, that simply radically inverted, the fact that Christianity and religion had always been in the center of American public life from the founding. If we're trying to kind of get back to a status quo ante, that doesn't make us, some sort of people who are outside of American tradition. And indeed, I mean, this is all trivial for you and probably even most of your listeners. But for those who don't know, right, like we had official state churches up into the 1830s in the United States. So this notion that somehow, it could even be in question that invoking a god or even invoking a Christian god in a public context could be unconstitutional. It's just risible, and it doesn't matter whether that offends the sensibilities of people who've been indoctrinated by this mid-20th century consensus. That's the historical reality, and we need to use power to push back against that.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's totally true. And, even if you disagree with the founding generation or something, the argument that it's like anti-American to push this
beyond the pale.
That's beyond the pale. Like maybe you don't like that. Maybe you see the collapse of the old constitutional order as a good thing. Okay, that's a different debate. But history's on our side. Yeah, we're the ones defending the original republic, and we're pushing back against its liquidation.
Right. And what you see right now in the public square is a different religion. It's the religion of transgenderism. It's the religion of homosexuality. It's the religion of everything else that is
abortion rights.
Yeah. I mean, that's the God, or secularism. Quite frankly, that's the God that we need to worship right now. It is not a public square with no God. It's a public square with a God that is antithetical to the God of the founders that for the country that they thought they were founding and that existed in the United States. And so it's sort of recovering that. And at the same time, I think we need to be realistic. I mean, I use the term rolling back the clock. I actually kind of want to back away from that slightly because I actually don't like that type of terminology because you can't reverse the sands of time. It's getting to a new place that is some sort of a synthesis, but that at least recovers to the maximum possible extent the sorts of animating principles that founded the country. But recognizing obviously that we're in a different situation and we're not going back to some sort of magical status quo ante, no matter what the ante you want to choose is.
Yeah, I think that in terms of rolling back history or something like that, I think a better way to approach it, of course, is to just deny this ideology of progress, where everything in the past is bad and it's evil, and that we need to overcome the past, and that like whatever's the most current moment in time, that's the good. So you don't have to like roll back to the past, but what you have to recognize is like, look, the past is something that's worth learning from and emulating, and there's honor and nobility there.
Yeah.
Our ancestors were actually people that are worthy of praise, and we can stand on their shoulders, and that it's possible for civilization to decline. Like these are all things that challenge the liberal consensus.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think, the kind of one trivial way to look at this that I often use, because I think it's just sort of vivid, is that we went from a small, tiny collection of besieged settlements on a small part of the eastern seaboard to the greatest economic and political power in the country, in the world, which we did by 1890, by the way. By 1890, we had the largest economy in the world. We did that without kind of like almost any of what we'd call modernity today kind of creeping in, either demographically, ideologically, in terms of the role of the state. Like we didn't need any of that to move from this place that was very, very marginal to this place of incredible success that God blessed us with. And so this kind of notion that sort of we needed all this modernity, that we needed everything that came along with the post-war consensus to be successful as a country, that diversity is inherently, no matter how hard you push it, a strength. It's belied by the reality of American history, where we had these huge successes without doing any of that, essentially.
So. Yeah, I think you bring up the point that because I've done this in the past too, and it's like rhetorically it confuses things more than it helps to be like, yeah, we just need to roll back to a certain period of time, right? The status quo ante, as you say, and that of course isn't helpful.
Well, it can be fun and provocative.
Well, it can be, but what people who are steeped in the theology of the post-war consensus from cradle to grave, what they hear with that is, you want to bring back Jim Crow, you want to bring back slavery, you want to bring back all the bad things from the past.
Right.
When you say those things, they don't think, oh, actually, I'm looking at socioeconomic indicators like out of wedlock births that were better 100 years ago for all races. Right? They don't think of those things, right? That's not the first thing that comes to their head. It's like, why do you hate black people, right? Like that's that's what they hear when you say that. And so, yeah, I don't like using that kind of language either. Rather, saying, right, there are things in our past that were good, that were massive blessings that we should recover, that have been destroyed. And we can have our cake and eat it too, right? We can admit that there have been, there have been genuine progresses that have taken place over time. And also, right, that came at a cost of maybe a far greater cost that destroys the capital, not just economically, but socially and culturally, to bring those things about. Where like we need to recover this social and cultural capital that we've lost, the inheritance that we've lost, without destroying everything. Like that kind of explanation, I think, is so much better. And so, looking at this in the broader, picture, I kind of want to circle back a little bit more, because, maybe, people don't even know the terms, people listening to this now don't even know what these terms mean, or what the state of this argument is, that, basically, and I'll let you explain it more too, Jeremy. This is a long question, like always. But you have, liberalism, which is a particular ideology. It's a particular political vision where the questions of the political are mostly all settled, right? You're just dealing with marginal stuff between Democrats and Republicans. Like the major questions of the political those are all dealt with. We don't have to worry about friend and enemy and
Right.
conflict of visions anymore. We're all Americans. Everything is so wonderful.
Right.
And those things have been manipulated. Liberalism was manipulated by the left over the last 80 years at least
to neuter the right,
to destroy the right, and to bring in their vision of what they want. Right. So liberalism was a mask. It wasn't like politics ended.
Yeah.
It kept chugging along, but the right was shut down completely. Right. And so there was no pushback against any of the things that they wanted for the last 80 years. And now, we can invoke his name with Trump, right? You have the very beginnings of a resurgent actual right, political right that isn't strictly within that liberal paradigm, right? It's outside the liberal paradigm. And so there are conservatives, or self-styled conservative interlopers who see the burgeoning rightism that has come along with Trump, that wants to wield power against bad things, and they are terrified of it. Right? They attack it and they say this is just like the woke left. Right? This is just like the woke left. And it's, I mean, and it's just palpably untrue. Right? There are no similarities whatsoever in any of this.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
I do think that the similarity is that we're both anti-liberal.
We're both using power to confront.
We're more honest about the nature of politics, I think, is what's going on.
Right.
Jeremy.
Yeah.
No, and sure, and I think that's true. And even it's not even just Trump, but I think there's a lot of people that they just don't even understand it. And unfortunately, I think a lot of our biggest enemies are the people who do understand exactly kind of what our challenge means. And they realize that it's a threat to the unearned privileges that, by the way, aren't even really popular with the American people in most cases that they have. And so you get a situation in which, and it's not even just Trump. It's like it's a guy like J.D. Vance saying, there is an American people. We're not just this idea. And of course, immediately the left comes back, and if you use that type of language, it's like, well, you're ethno-nationalists. And look, I mean, obviously J.D. Vance, right, is intermarried to somebody who is not of not a kind of white American and has multiracial family. But I think what he's saying is correctly, like, it's not totally irrelevant, right? Like, we couldn't just totally replace demographically the American people, even if we can argue about like what types of immigration and at what volumes we can. Those are legitimate discussions and debates that we can have, and people can have different views of it. But we're not just a propositional nation. We're actually a historic people, and we get to decide who gets to be a part of that people over time. That type of language, that type of concept being put out by a guy like Vice President-elect Vance, who really understands what he's talking about, that's very, very threatening to the left, because again, these are sacred cows that you're really goring in this case.
Yeah, that's a good pun that you used there. Invoking Vance's Hindu wife. I don't know if that was intentional, but yeah. Anyway,
it was not. It was clearly not intentional, but until I did just recognized it as you mentioned it right there.
So like, one of the things that I want to emphasize too is that what's being defended here by the woke center, let's call them the woke center. Yeah. But like what's being invoked here is actually not even a classical liberalism. Like the constitutional founders, the pre-constitutional founders, were like John Locke. Like all of these people were like Anglo-imperialists, and they denied a role within civil society for atheists and Muslims and stuff. So like they're not even defending classical liberals. They're defending 20th century American consensus liberalism. They despise, most of the ethos of the 19th century political, like the way that Andrew Jackson talked, the way that John Calhoun talked, the way that Henry Clay talked, Alexander Hamilton, all of these, George Washington, all of them were focused on particularities, not universalisms. Like even Thomas Jefferson, like, so the classical liberals are actually much more similar to some of the things that we have in mind, not the people accusing us of being fascists, right?
Right. Oh, absolutely. And right. I mean, you're very much they are invoking this again 20th century phenomenon of what they think this should look like, rather than how the founders would have understood it. And I think the same thing goes for Christianity. I mean, if you want to invoke America as a fundamentally Christian nation in the broadest sense, and I think I would say that that's a good thing. That doesn't mean per se that you're denying religious freedom for any other person that doesn't subscribe to those things. I mean, that would certainly personally not be my view. I mean, other people do have different views, but
Well, the funny thing is, like, if you actually open-mindedly read Stephen Wolf's book,
yeah,
he endorses the constitutional order, the old constitutional order.
yeah, no, for sure. But I
Yeah.
mean, if you say that, right, like that's very threatening to their kind of secular fundamentalism that they think needs to rule everything. But it's very much in line with the way the vast majority of founders would have thought about America. And by the America from the beginning had a degree of religious pluralism, and certainly had a huge degree of religious pluralism within the Christian community.
Right.
But it had a kind of, at the end of the day, like, very few people really disputed that it was. I mean, the vast majority of people were Christians, and that viewpoint animated America from the founding.
Yeah, you're right, Jeremy. Like, the people don't know this, right? The elites don't want you to know this. That the reason there is a First Amendment is not, and I think we talk about this all the time, but like the reason there's a First Amendment is not to produce secularism, right? Not to enshrine secularism as the state religion.
It was to promise the established churches that the federal government would not intervene with them.
Right.
Yeah. So the narrow band of pluralism among the various denominations of Christians in the various states, that was what was being protected by the First Amendment, not secularism, right? It's such a lie. Like, you read the things that they wrote about the debates about the First Amendment, why they did it, right? That's what it's about. And the moment you discover that, it's like, whoa, I've been lied to about everything.
Right. Well, people who are not aware of that, and are not aware that we had established state churches, well after the founding of America, like, I just don't even engage with them in these arguments. They're not serious people. They're not seriously aware of really what our history was. They've been brainwashed by the mid 20th century Supreme Court and media and everything else, making a bunch of very, very radical decisions that were totally outside of America's tradition and history. And now, if we push back about that and say, hey, we would like to return to the constitutional order, at least in these respects, the way the founders envisioned it, then we are fascists, and we're trying to we're extremists, and it's absurd. And so I engage honestly less and less. I'm not happy about this. I mean, I think it's sad for the country, but I engage less and less with the left, because they're bad. They're either dumb or bad faith actors 90+% of the time. There's a small sliver with whom you can really have at least a good faith engagement based on mutual knowledge. But I ultimately think that these debates need to be settled within the genuine right, and not among people, by the way, who use terms like woke right either.
Right. Hey, Jeremy, I was going to ask you, I mean, we have our own experiences of just interacting with people on Main Street, and just, I'm curious, do you think a lot of people are sort of like the scales are falling from their eyes about consensus thinking, just in the conservative movement? I know the conservative movement has gone through, the 90s and 2000s were very tough for the quality of the conservative movement. But do you think that things are getting better in terms of our ability to actually penetrate consensus thinking?
I do. I mean, it's a war, and what we're about to go do. I mean, I said from the beginning that getting Trump elected, as hard as that was by far the easiest thing that we had in front of us, right? That's the table stakes to even get in the game, and we got it. That's also we have table stakes now to sit at the table. You're beginning to see with some of these cabinet nominations, who are people who I whatever you say, positive or negative about personal qualities, I mean, that has nothing to do with why they're being opposed. They're being opposed because they are threats to various elements of that consensus that we've been talking about, their threats to the existing regime's power. I think certainly as a guy who was like a Ron Paul guy back in 2008, it's a world difference, right? Like everything is just a trillion times better. I mean, like you couldn't even say, like if you were a Buchananite, and again, I plead guilty, right? Like if you were one of those guys back then, you just had no hearing.
Right.
Yeah.
Now you're very much, I think, because of Trump, you're very much in the mainstream, and people can talk about those things and be very upfront about that. And I think that's great. And you're seeing, I think, a younger generation of politicians who do get it. But still, we've got a huge problem with a lot of our electeds and that they don't. But certainly, even though I'd say it's still a minority, the number of people just among kind of like my fellow men on the street in Montana, my friends in church, who kind of get it intuitively, even if they're not political people, it is a lot higher. It's an order of magnitude higher, at least, than what it was a couple decades ago. I think the challenge we have is it's probably got to be 5x even where we are right now before we can really begin to turn this ship around. But we've got a base to go forward, and for folks like me who've really been through the wars, starting a couple decades ago, we're just in an infinitely better place than we were. So I am appreciative of that.
I mean, I agree that momentum's on our side, and part of that is just the complete reputational collapse of neoconservatism. I think plays a large role in that. I mean, if you look at like the things that Bill Kristol tweets, like nobody likes the neocons anymore. Like just nobody gives this. Like you could be on the far left, you could be on the far right, you could be a constitutionalist. Nobody cares.
I mean, as an aside, I think it has to be the biggest own goal of the entire presidential campaign, filled with them by Kamala Harris, was campaigning with Liz Cheney.
Yeah. Number one. Like, I agree.
Nobody likes her, and they literally thought, "Oh, this is a Republican. People will see that there's unity between us." And it's like nobody likes her.
Right.
Nobody.
Well, it was a huge gift to us, right? Because it's just we have, to use Marx in a way that is beautiful. We heightened the contradictions, right? That's right. Like, and that's useful. That's a useful way, by the way, to look at reality. And it doesn't mean that I'm a woke, whatever, the woke right. We've dramatically cleaved off the hardcore neoconservatives, where even though they have so much power, particularly in places like DOD, even still, but they're going to have a hard time fully grasping it back. And a lot of what I think we're seeing about Hegseth right now in DOD is about that. It's like they realize that they kind of played their cards really badly, and they're desperately trying to hold on. But the reality is they really have finally just screwed up so much that they can't totally get back in, and they haven't come to terms with that. But it was a huge gift. And again, as someone who was attacking Liz Cheney from far before it was fashionable, again, when I talk about progress, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Totally,
Or Bill Kristol, the fact that he's now a laughing stock and totally marginal, to any conservative discussion, or Jen Rubin, or these sorts of people. Those folks, the Liz Cheneys, the fact that they're not getting back in the tent, and that's great news.
I was worried in 2022 that that they were making progress back in after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because like the regular normal conservative people I would see around town, they would see, they'd hear what I would have to say about the war that's taking place, and I knew I'd been paying attention since 2014, right? I knew all the facts about it, and I'm explaining why it's not what they're saying on the TV. Like, they're lying to you about all this stuff. And the reaction, people were angry at me. Like, people I was close, they get furious. Like, why do you love Putin? Like, you're a traitor. And I'm like, no, guys, that's not what's going on at all. But then very slowly over the next year or so, that propaganda, it it wore off
Yeah.
really quickly. And it's like, well, why are we sending hundreds of billions of dollars over to Ukraine? And
Right.
isn't that where Hunter Biden, like, took all the money and like, oh yeah, something is going on.
That's the key, and I think that was the discouraging thing, because I saw a lot of the same things you did. Again, I mean, I think one nice thing about where I am, and I think where you guys are, is I'm around normal people in my daily life, not weird DC people. Was the fact it was discouraging that, like, Ukraine was the center of the op that first impeached Trump, and the fact that there wasn't more critical thinking on the right immediately when it was like, hey, let's go to war to defend Ukraine as our sacred value. That was kind of discouraging. Again, I'm an expansive guy. I'm a friendly guy. I'm ecumenical. Like, if people want to have like a midway point view on Ukraine, I'm not reading them out of the movement. But the fact that, like, there wasn't immediately an awareness from everybody, even the people who were saying, hey, we really need to stand up to Russia against, on behalf of Ukraine, the fact that there at least wasn't the awareness that, hey, isn't it interesting that Ukraine was sort of the center of the thing that was they tried to take out our president with, that was kind of discouraging. But again, as you pointed out, it did fall away pretty quickly. So we have a problem with electeds on Ukraine, but I think our voters are largely in the right place now.
Oh yeah, the voters are probably as a whole to the right, compared to the Congress, right? Compared to the representatives. And those are healthy. Those are healthy signs.
Yeah, like, I mean, this point here, and I think the other factor in all of this is most definitely Tucker, who is I think after spending years kind of in the neocon media establishment, around 2015, 2016, became very, very paleocon. Like, he took a very hard paleocon turn, and his rise, like, I mean, he gets fired from Fox News probably because of what he was saying about the war, I guess, contradicting the propaganda they're paid to shill. And so, like, this moment, I think that the Common Co here says in the comment section, Tucker destroying Mike Pence at the Blaze forum in Iowa, 2 summers ago. That was the nail in the coffin for neoconservatism. I think that's exactly right. That's not my concern when he's talking about our cities being overrun with fentanyl and crime and destruction. Like, that's not my concern. Like, that was it. It's over at that point. Like, you don't care about our country. You care about this more than that.
I mean, that's the thing that happened too. It's like people realized we have to choose between the spreading of these like hypothetical ideas and what's good for the American people. Like, the American people are struggling right now, and yet we're more interested in like democratic idealism on the other side of the planet. I mean, people are having to choose between universal ideals, propositions, and who we are. Those are types of, like, crossroads that we have to go down, and the American people are recognizing that, like, we can't just be this forever militant messiah, for world peace.
We definitely stand at a fork in the road, and it is and it's obvious. I mean, the question of, should our elected officials care about our country first, our people first, right? And all of the problem, we have many problems here. Why are we concerned about all these other things? Why are we importing tens of millions of people to the country when when our economy is garbage? Like all these kinds of things. And they don't have an answer. Like, the elected people, the people running for office that have shilled this this party line for decades, they don't have an answer to those questions anymore. They can't pass it off as, well, we stand for democracy. That's why we're doing these things. Like, it's falling on deaf ears, because the tension is heightened so much more because we are undergoing serious, significant decline that was revealed in, I think, for everyone in 2020. And so, I think like, that's like the circumstances, as much as any personal figures like Trump or Tucker, the circumstances of for our country today are driving this as much as anything else, right? As much as Tucker and Trump are. So
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, it's like reality always gets a vote. That is, and that's the one encouraging thing, right? Like reality is ultimately our friend over the long run. Even leaving aside various religious factors that are on our side for the long run that should give any of us comfort. But yeah, I mean, I think Ukraine just sort of dramatically showed the contradiction between this ideological nation that the left and the establishment right want to have, this democracy promotion on steroids after the disasters in Iraq and Iran, Iraq and Afghanistan. So a lot of people like to bring it to Iran as well. That versus the very real problems that we have at home. And again, we're just asking to go back to an America that looks out for its interests, right? And we had a Monroe Doctrine, and it was always seen from the time of John Quincy Adams, right? We're not going to go out and search for monsters to destroy, and to kind of push back against the consensus in that way. And again, this is in many ways that consensus is a product of everything that happened in World War II. But the notion that you can't oppose this type of ideological fanaticism in politics without being a Nazi is absurd. I mean, I think foreign policy scholars are going to get angry with me about the particulars here because there's a lot of nuance here. But just at a trivial level, I would argue the biggest major statesman we had, maybe except George Kennan, who kind of really pushed these ideals of national interest, was Henry Kissinger, himself a refugee from Nazism, right? Who was not kind of enraptured by these airy ideas around, democratizing the world, but like, well, what's America's interest in all this? Again, I'm not like a pure Kissingerian. It's not to say that, there are not elements of his legacy that I don't like, but this kind of notion that if you challenge this kind of democracy promotion consensus, this liberal human rights kind of view of what America needs to look like abroad, that you're a fascist or a Nazi, it's absurd.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we could do a whole hour talking about Kissinger and the politics of the Cold War and Nixon. I don't have it up yet, but like,
I love the Nixon revival, by the way, on the right.
The Nixon. I found in my dad's shop my grandpa's Richard Nixon poster from the 1960 election, and it's gonna hang up on the wall soon. But
very base.
My parents, they were big. Or my grandparents and great grandparents, they were actually like Taft Republicans.
Oh, that's the best.
Yes.
That's
they were anti-New Dealers. And so that's my my German Reformed blood legacy.
But there is this degeneration among elites right around this time, and I mean, to me the classic example of it, because you start talking about grandparents, is Warren Buffett's father, Howard Buffett. As you guys probably know, but maybe a lot of your listeners here don't. I mean, he was a conservative Nebraska congressman who was one of the leading lights of the old right that we had in Congress ever. And that's Warren Buffett's hero. And yet Warren Buffett has kind of transmogrified into this. I mean, it's not that he's a particularly pernicious example, but he in every way kind of embodies this kind of globalist elite that thinks in a totally different way than Howard Buffett would have thought about America and what its interests are. And, the decline in thinking from a Howard Buffett to a Warren Buffett, regardless of his success in the stock market, is kind of sad to observe.
Well,
it's a great example. It's a great illustration of what happened. I mean, like, you need to be reading like Howard Buffett and the old right, like that, just that classic Midwesterner look. Like, we have our own problems. We, we're raising cattle and growing corn, and like that's what America is to us. And we have no interest in invading Europe for Europe's problems. Like that, America first is so core to the American like political ethos that I think that just recovering those things, you don't even have to look at European continental thinkers. Just look at what we have right here in the 20th century, the opponents of progressivism.
Well, just even to think the phrase "America first." I mean, I'm just all of a sudden blanking on the guy who wrote the book in 2008, kind of an idiosyncratic, not even right winger, but he wrote a history of America First as a movement more broadly. I think he was like a Front Porch Republic guy. I'm embarrassed that I'm blanking on his name.
Oh, yeah, Bill Kaufman.
Bill Kaufman.
Yeah.
I bought that book at a time, I think it was 2007, 2008 when it came out, that America First was still a dirty word. Like you were a Nazi if you were saying the words America First. I think one of the things that he does really helpfully in that book is kind of explode the whole myth, and he kind of walks through the very multivaried ideologies that went into America First. But now, I mean, to talk about the progress we've made, you could say America First, and that's like totally fine now. In fact, I think people think it's good, and they should think it's good, because that should be our interest, is to put America first. It doesn't mean America only at all times, no matter what is going on anywhere in the world, even if it's just us lifting a small finger. But it means at the end of the day, we're a country that looks out for the interests of its citizens first, and we do that unapologetically. And that is the nature of what any leader should do of any country. And the fact that we're now able to just state that without apology, even if we do get this huge pushback from the left, that's, again, real progress that we've made.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I'm just so bullish on the future, politically, for America, and it isn't even just because Trump won, only because, I mean, obviously that's a big one, right? But more broadly, the fact that, like, genuinely conservative and right wing ideas are no longer cast to the very fringes. And I mean, the other thing about that is, like, when things are pushed off into the fringes, you get the kind of people that do believe all sorts of loony things, and it gets associated with that. Like, that's purposeful. That's why they push it to the fringes.
Right.
And so it being brought, inside the Overton window, right, inside public discourse, where regular people can evaluate these questions and ask, wait a second, why are we sending hundreds of billions of dollars literally to the other side of the world, when, like, my grandma can't get insulin, right? Or my next door neighbor, his kid took a pill and died, right? Like, why? We have all these problems here. Why am I not allowed? Why am I supposed to be told that I'm a racist or ethnocentric or something like that, because I care about the problems in my country, in my neighborhood, and to bring that question back up, like, do our leaders care about the interests of our people, or do they care about something else? And framing it that way, now normal people can evaluate these questions like, oh, I don't think they actually do care about, my interests whatsoever. Whoa, that's crazy.
And I think this is a really important thing that you've raised, by the way, the point of the value of just not being marginalized, because as I mean, if you were involved in the Ron Paul stuff back or even further, there is a certain type of person who might agree with us on a lot of things ideologically, but they have a certain love of being marginal. And they begin to just sort of, they love to spiral. They love to divide and not conjugate as a political movement. And they can descend, unfortunately. I mean, I'm not going to punch right against them, because it's their thing, that they can descend into crankery. And I think, or worse, the advantage of these things being moved into the mainstream is that it gives, I think, the vast majority of people who may share some of those views, but who want to be productive and mainstream, it gives them an opportunity to say, hey, we are going to build coalitions. We can be productive. We're not having this psychological addiction to being, this is like dissident right. No, we don't want to be dissident right. We want to be the right, period. Right. And I think there is going to have to be a cleaving on our side, not because we're going to push people out, but because they'll sort of push themselves out, between those who are in love with the idea of being a dissident for dissident's sake, and for those who would like to take our views and make them the mainstream right, and understand that in our political society, that's invariably going to involve give and take. It's going to involve using power unapologetically, but it's also going to involve compromise. And so I think just giving a space for us to be able to do that as a movement is really encouraging, and it will strengthen our movement over the long term.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I agree. I know, Jeremy, we probably have like a minute left, so we can start to wind down here. But I guess, in the last 30 seconds here, what is the future of the right? Do you think that these types of woke right style attacks are going to be, hurled at us? Do you think we have momentum on our side? What do you think?
Well, I think it's been incredibly encouraging, even as somebody who pushed Trump pretty hard. I was not expecting some of these cabinet nominees to be as strong as they've been. I would have loved if we could have kept Gates, despite his personal struggles in the past. But we've got some other really good folks out there, and I think that these are people who are not just time servers. These are people who really are going to push back, and that's why they're getting the pushback that they're getting, because these people really do want to disrupt the current regime. I think it's going to be a time of testing, for which we're going to need a lot of faith over the next year or so, I think, in particular, because we are really entering into the citadels of the regime's power, and they are going to push back ferociously. It's going to be hand-to-hand combat. We can only hope and pray for President Trump to sort of stay strong through some of the slings and arrows, and let's hope those are just metaphorical. His way.
I mean, deep regimes don't just walk away from power.
No, of course not. So we are going to have a real struggle on our hands, and it's going to feel ugly. And I would just encourage people to not get discouraged, because that's what it looks like. As you say, they don't walk away from power. They are going to fight like hell, and we need to be able to match them in energy and in enthusiasm. But the good news is that we're even in a position to fight that battle.
Yes.
And I don't think we're going to win that battle in the next 4 years, no matter how well Trump does. But again, one of the great, arguably the best thing Trump did in the campaign is in picking J.D. Vance. He picked a potential successor who really cares about these issues, who brings his own set of strength. There's certain things he's never going to do as well as Trump, but there's also certain things that he can do well that are not Trump's strengths. And so I think we have a real chance to be in the fight for the first time. We shouldn't be discouraged by resistance out there, because it's just an indication of our growing strength that they actually have to fight back against us as hard as they're doing.
Yeah, good.
Absolutely.
Well, Jeremy, we appreciate your time.
We have a super chat.
Okay, the super chat.
we have from $5 for Papa Alpaca. How do alpacas say Merry Christmas? Feliz Navidad. Happy Advent. Have you heard about Paca's based Advent playlist? I haven't. Put hat on profile picture. CJ, well, I don't want to lose the blue check mark if I do that. So I can't, I'm not going to change. I'm sorry. But yes, thank you. Happy Advent. And man, thank you so much, Jeremy, for coming on. Like this has been, I think, a very enlightening conversation. I think it'll be useful for our audience, and something they can go back to and learn a lot about. I mean, this is such a fascinating topic, especially the old right and the political tradition in America. Like, I mean, we could talk for 5 more hours about this, but I'm so happy you gave us one. So
thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, I appreciate it, guys. It's always a pleasure to talk.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you, guys. Well, everyone, thank you for watching. As always, please like and subscribe and share and all of those good things. And until next Friday,
we'll see.
Until next time, stay peacefully dangerous, and we will see you next time.